You were never meant to hear this. The records were sealed, the evidence buried, and the whispers chased out of official history, but the truth has a way of rotting beneath the floorboards, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to lift the plank. On a cold morning in 1851, deep in the untouched wilderness of New York's Adirondack Mountains, 3 men stumbled upon a cabin that should never have existed. What they found inside would mark them forever, and what I am about to tell you will do the same to you, because this isn't a ghost story, and it isn't just frontier folklore. This is about a boy named Benjamin Harwick, a child who spoke a language no human should know, a tongue that had no right to exist in this world. Imagine stepping into that cabin, the smell of smoke mixed with decay, the air thick with something sour that clings to your lungs. Animal bones dangled from strings like ritual charms. Symbols carved into the walls bled with dark stains, as if written in substances no scripture would allow, and in the center of it all sat the boy, thin, sharp-boned, eyes that glowed not with innocence, but with something older, something colder. When he spoke, his words didn't just sound alien, they twisted the air itself, carrying a rhythm that made men's hearts seize, their stomachs churn, their instincts scream to turn and flee. Benjamin didn't cry for help. He didn't beg. He didn't even seem to recognize rescue as a concept. Instead, he spoke rapidly, urgently, in his impossible tongue, as though trying to warn them or command them of things they could not understand. And the more he spoke, the more the cabin itself seemed alive. The carvings on the walls shimmered in the firelight, shapes that resisted meaning but pressed against the mind with crushing weight. What you must understand is this: Benjamin was not a feral child. He was not a victim of chance. He was a creation. His mind had been shaped, his very consciousness re-engineered by a father who sought to strip away civilization itself. This boy was the product of a forbidden experiment, an experiment to erase morality, to replace thought, and to build a language that could control the soul. And from the moment those men stepped into that cabin, the Harwick secret stopped being theirs alone. It entered history like poison into the bloodstream. To understand the horror of Benjamin Harwick, you must first understand his father. Ezra Harwick was no backwoods simpleton. He was educated, articulate, a man who once believed in reason and philosophy, but knowledge is a double-edged blade. In the wrong hands, it doesn't illuminate, it burns. Ezra came to believe that civilization itself was a sickness, that words like justice, mercy, freedom were not truths, but shackles. He whispered to his wife that society was nothing but a prison made of language, where men obeyed words instead of instincts. And slowly, he began to build a cure. The family withdrew deeper into the Adirondack wilderness, cutting off all contact with the outside world. Their valley was isolated by ridges and rivers, the kind of place no stranger could stumble upon. There, Ezra's project began. He raised his children on his own terms, feeding them not only from the forest but from his mind, teaching them that the words of civilization were poison, that their mouths must shape only the sounds of a truer tongue. This was not some random babble. Ezra was designing a system. He tore words apart, replaced them with new ones, stripped his children's thinking down to raw bone, and then rebuilt it brick by brick with symbols that only he could define. Language is not just communication, it is perception. It tells you what exists and what doesn't. If you have no word for freedom, can you ever truly desire it? If there is no word for wrong, can cruelty even be recognized? Ezra knew this. He weaponized it, and Benjamin was the masterpiece of this weaponized tongue. By 1851, when the hunting party found him, he wasn't just speaking a strange language, he was thinking in it, trapped inside it. His very reality had been coded like a machine that could only run the program its creator installed. The journals found in that cabin reveal Ezra's descent, his obsession with what he called the great work. He wrote of purification, of remaking humanity, of erasing false morality and teaching his children the true laws of nature. He didn't see himself as a madman. He saw himself as a prophet. and Benjamin was his chosen vessel. The boy's mouth did not form English cries for help, because the concept of help itself did not exist in his world. That was the horror. He was not lost. He was complete, according to the design of his father's madness. The men who discovered Benjamin that day were not scholars. They were hunters, rough men of the frontier who had seen death in many forms, but nothing prepared them for the sound of that boy's voice. Later, one of them would confess that hearing Benjamin speak was like standing at the edge of a cliff with the ground crumbling beneath your feet. The words had no meaning, yet they carried force. Each syllable scraped against the mind, demanding attention, refusing to be dismissed. One hunter vomited. Another pressed his hands over his ears until blood trickled down from the force of his own nails, and Benjamin only stared as though confused by their suffering, as if to him the sound was not strange at all. It was natural. When they finally dragged him out of the cabin, the boy resisted, not with fists, not with screams, but with more of that impossible language. His tone shifted into what could only be described as command. And something terrible happened. The men stopped moving. For a brief moment their arms slackened, their bodies unresponsive, as though caught in a trance. It was only when one of them shouted a prayer to break the silence that the spell shattered, and they carried the child into the light. But none of them spoke of what they felt. Not yet. Word spread quickly once they reached town. Whispers of a feral child abandoned, raised by beasts, but those who had seen the cabin knew better. They remembered the carvings etched into the walls, spirals, jagged lines and patterns that seemed to pulse when you stared too long. They remembered the journals scattered on the table filled with Ezra Harwick's furious handwriting, raving about undoing Babel and the death of false words. They remembered the stench of rot, not from beasts, but from something far worse. Human remains, half buried near the hearth. Benjamin was taken in by the local authorities, but the town was divided. Some pitied him, calling him a victim of lunacy. Others whispered that he was dangerous, not just broken but wrong. Children followed him in the streets, mocking his strange mutterings. Adults crossed themselves when his eyes lingered too long, and all the while the boy never spoke a word of English, not once, not a single syllable of the world he had been born into. Benjamin Harwick was a child among men, yet he was utterly alien, and that alien nature was beginning to spread. At first, the townsfolk treated Benjamin as a curiosity, an oddity dragged in from the wilderness. But curiosity has a short lifespan when fear begins to gnaw. The local magistrate ordered him placed with a caretaker, an older widow who believed kindness might tame the strangeness. She gave him food, warmth, and a bed, but kindness meant nothing to a boy raised in a world where such concepts had never been named. To Benjamin, bread was not bread. It was something else entirely, an object with a word no one else could speak. The old woman would place the food in his hands, only for him to mutter "Haim," his alien syllables, and set it aside. He did not reject it out of malice. He simply could not attach meaning to what she offered. Days turned into weeks, and rumors swelled. The widow began to notice unsettling patterns. At night, Benjamin would carve shapes into the wooden frame of the bed with a sharp stone, repeating the same spirals found on the walls of the Harwick cabin. Sometimes she awoke to find him standing in the corner, whispering to himself in that jagged tongue, eyes closed, swaying like a worshipper before some unseen altar. Once she swore the walls of her cottage quivered as he spoke. The townspeople began to avoid the house. Livestock grew skittish when led past it. Children claimed they heard Benjamin's voice in their dreams, calling them by names he should not have known. Men who had witnessed his rescue grew silent, refusing to describe what they had seen. The town preacher thundered from the pulpit that the boy was a vessel of corruption, a reminder that Satan did not come with horns and fire, but with whispers and words. Yet still, some resisted that fear. A doctor from Albany arrived, intrigued by the reports. He insisted the boy was not possessed but a victim of psychological conditioning, a cruel experiment that stripped him of language and replaced it with gibberish. He argued that with time and education, Benjamin could be reintroduced into society, reshaped into a normal child. His logic reassured some, but others asked the question none dared voice aloud. What if it wasn't gibberish? What if the boy's language had power? Because already strange things were happening. Fights broke out in the tavern after men swore they heard Benjamin's words echoing in their skulls. A farmer's wife claimed she saw him speaking to the crows, and the crows answered. And the widow, once so full of pity, locked her door at night and whispered to her neighbors, "This boy is not learning from us. He is teaching." The town's unease turned to dread when the widow was found dead in her bed on May autumn morning. Her body bore no wounds, no signs of struggle, yet her face was frozen in a mask of terror, eyes wide open as though she had seen something no human was meant to witness. Benjamin was discovered sitting calmly beside her, tracing circles on the wall with his finger, humming in that strange rhythm. When questioned, he gave no explanation, only a stream of words in his impossible tongue. The doctor tried to argue she had died of natural causes, that fear and rumor had poisoned the community's imagination, but those who looked into the boy's eyes were not convinced. The magistrate had Benjamin removed to a small stone building at the edge of town, a place that once served as a holding cell for drunks and thieves. Guards were placed at the door, instructed to keep watch and record the boy's behavior. It should have been simple, but soon the men began reporting strange phenomena. One claimed Benjamin's voice echoed in his dreams, whispering phrases he could not recall upon waking. Another swore he heard his deceased mother's voice when the boy spoke, though her lips never moved. Some men fled their posts altogether, refusing to return. The doctor persisted, believing discipline and repetition could force Benjamin into English. He would hold up objects, a cup, a book, a candle, naming each in slow, careful tones. But Benjamin always countered with his own word, a syllable that bent the air, heavy and strange, and when he repeated it long enough, the object itself seemed to lose meaning. The guards began to whisper that after hearing Benjamin speak, the cup no longer looked like a cup. It became something alien, unnameable, stripped of its place in the world. Ezra Harwick's journals, studied more closely now, revealed his intent with chilling clarity. He believed words were the foundation of control, that to redefine language was to redefine reality itself. A man who cannot speak of chains, Ezra wrote, cannot be enslaved. A man who cannot speak of mercy cannot be bound by pity. His goal was not to raise children, but to build vessels for a language that could unmake human thought. Benjamin was not a victim of neglect. He was the first prototype of a new species. And the town began to realize that Ezra's experiment had not ended with his death. It was still unfolding, inside the mouth of a boy who had never spoken a word they could understand. The townsfolk whispered that Benjamin's words carried a curse. They spoke of cattle found dead in their stalls, eyes clouded, bodies twisted as if seized in their final moments. They spoke of children waking in the night, screaming about voices clawing at their minds. Even grown men admitted to hearing whispers that were not their own thoughts, syllables that scraped across their skull like knives. The magistrate tried to dismiss these fears, but doubt gnawed at him. He had heard Benjamin speak only once, and the memory still sent chills down his spine. The doctor clung to science. He claimed these were delusions, hysteria born of fear. Yet even he could not explain what happened one rain-soaked evening when he sat across from Benjamin with a slate and chalk. He wrote the word house and pointed to the building around them. Then he urged the boy to repeat it. Instead, Benjamin erased the word and scrawled his own jagged symbol, something like a spiral hooked with teeth. He pressed his palm against it and whispered, and then the roof groaned. The stone walls trembled as if gripped by invisible hands. The doctor stumbled back in terror, insisting later it must have been thunder. But those who were present knew better. Ezra Harwick's journals grew darker the further they were read. His writings revealed that he had once attempted to speak the new language himself, but could not bear it. "It corrodes the tongue," he scrawled. "It carves the mind into new shapes. But the child, he is untouched by tea. He false words of man, he is pure clay. In him the new speech will root." Ezra had called the language Nithra, claiming it was not invention but revelation. Something whispered to him during nights of fasting and delirium, as though the wilderness itself had poured it into his mind. This claim spread terror. For if Ezra had not invented the language, then where had it come from? Was it merely the ravings of a broken mind, or had he uncovered something older, something meant to stay hidden? Meanwhile, Benjamin's influence deepened. The guards who lasted longest at their posts began to mutter fragments of his tongue in their sleep. One man woke screaming after catching himself reciting words he swore he had never learned. He begged to be released from duty. "The boy is teaching us," he said, trembling, "and I don't want to know what comes next." The town was no longer asking whether Benjamin could be saved. They were asking whether they could be saved from him. Winter closed over the valley like a coffin lid, and with it came a suffocating dread. The snow silenced the world, muffling sound, isolating the town from the outside, and in that silence Benjamin's voice seemed louder. The guards claimed his mutterings could be heard even when he sat motionless, lips closed. They swore the sound crawled through the stone walls of his cell, pressing into their ears like water seeping through cracks. The townsfolk began to gather in secret meetings, desperate for answers. Some wanted to send Benjamin away, march him into the wilderness and abandon him where he had been found. Others whispered of harsher solutions, a rope, a pyre, anything to silence the unnatural child. Yet a few argued against it. The doctor, stubborn in his reasoning, insisted that killing Benjamin would be murder of an innocent. "He is a boy shaped by a father's madness," he said. "If there is evil here, it lay as in Ezra Harwick, not in his son." But others countered that a tool does not stop being dangerous just because it was forged by another hand. Meanwhile, more strange incidents plagued the town. A young girl vanished from her home, only to be found wandering near Benjamin's cell at dawn, barefoot in the snow, her lips moving soundlessly. She had no memory of how she got there. A blacksmith's wife was struck mute after passing the boy's window. Her voice returned days later, but she could only whisper, and sometimes the words that slipped out were not English at all. And then came the night the guards fled their posts entirely. One by one they abandoned the stone house, refusing to remain within earshot. The magistrate, furious, went himself to confront the boy. He claimed Benjamin sat still in the corner, staring at him with those hollow eyes, before uttering a single phrase. Just one. The magistrate fell to his knees, clutching his chest as though suffocated by invisible hands. He survived, but he never spoke of what he heard. From that day on, his hair turned grey, and his sermons grew sharp with warnings about the corruption of the tongue. By now, even the doctor had begun to falter. He confessed in a letter to a colleague that Benjamin's words were no random gibberish. They carried structure, rhythm, grammar, an entire system unto itself. It was, without doubt, a functioning language. But it was more than that. It was a system designed to erase the world as others knew it and replace it with something else. And Benjamin was no longer just speaking it. He was spreading it. The infection began slowly, so quietly that most dismissed it as coincidence. A farmer passing through the market muttered a strange word under his breath when he could not recall the English for wheat. A child, asked to recite her prayers, slipped in a syllable that no scripture had ever contained. These were brushed off as slips of the tongue, nonsense sounds, but they multiplied. Within weeks, half the town had uttered fragments of Benjamin's language without realizing it. Some swore it came to them in dreams, whispered by familiar voices that spoke in unfamiliar words. The doctor began keeping a ledger of these incidents, carefully recording each phrase. What unsettled him most was not their strangeness, but their consistency. They were not random. The same words surfaced again and again across different people, different households, as though they were spreading like a contagion. One word, repeated often, seemed to mean hunger. Another carried the weight of command. Another was spoken during moments of grief, as if it replaced death. The doctor's hand shook as he wrote in the margins, "This is not imitation. This is transmission." But the language did not just cling to words. It began to warp thought itself. A woman wept as she admitted she could no longer recall the name of her dead husband in English. Only Benjamin's word for him remained. A blacksmith confessed that when he held his tools he no longer thought of them as hammer and anvil. They had become something else, nameless in English but vivid in the other tongue. The world around them was being renamed, repainted, its foundations rewritten by sounds no one had consented to learn. And the boy at the center of it all, Benjamin, sat silent more often now, as though content to let the town speak for him. When he did speak, the walls of his cell seemed to thrum with energy. Sometimes he laughed, not the laugh of a child, but a sound that made listeners recoil, as though they had been mocked in a language their bones somehow understood. Fear gave way to desperation. The preacher thundered that the boy was no longer a victim, but a vessel, that he was teaching a language meant to erase the one God himself had given mankind. The Tower of Babel was torn down for less, he cried, and here we are building another with our own tongues. And still the people spoke the words, unable to stop themselves. The infection was no longer spreading. It was rooted. The council gathered in the town hall under lantern light, their faces pale and hollow from sleepless nights. The preacher demanded immediate action. "We must end this before the tongue consumes us," he thundered. "The boy must be destroyed and his cursed words silenced." Some nodded, desperate for a solution, but others hesitated. Even as they listened, they found themselves thinking in fragments of Benjamin's language, their own English words slipping from their grasp. How do you condemn something when your very thoughts are stitched together with its threads? The doctor argued for restraint. This is knowledge, not witchcraft. We stand at the threshold of discovery, a new language, a new structure of thought. It is our duty to understand it. His voice trembled, betraying the fever in his eyes. The preacher rounded on him. "You've already been poisoned. Can't you hear yourself? The words are inside you." Outside the hall, the townspeople grew restless. Families whispered of leaving, abandoning their homes before the sickness of speech hollowed them out completely. But leaving was not so simple. Some who tried claimed the forest itself resisted them, that when they walked the familiar trails, the paths bent in circles. They found themselves returning to the town, no matter how far they strayed, as if the valley had become a snare. The more they spoke of it, the more one word appeared on their lips. Benjamin's word for home. Meanwhile, in his stone cell, Benjamin sat cross-legged on the floor, etching symbols into the walls with a shard of slate. The guards no longer dared to stop him. Some had joined him, scratching the same spirals into the floorboards, their lips moving silently as they copied his murmurs. A visitor peering through the window at night might see half a dozen men swaying in rhythm with a child, repeating syllables that did not belong to this world. "We're home." And the magistrate entered to break the gathering. One of the guards lifted his head and spoke, not in English but in Benjamin's tongue. The magistrate recoiled, demanding he stop, but the guard only smiled, as though he had glimpsed something wonderful, something terrifyingly vast. "He is not teaching us," the guard said in halting English. "He is reminding us." The hall's debate ended with no resolution. They would meet again the next night, but deep down, most knew the truth. The choice was slipping from their hands. The language was no longer confined to the boy. It was in them now, and it was growing. By the time the council met again, fear had hardened into resolve. The preacher insisted that words alone would no longer save them. "We face a plague not of flesh, but of spirit," he declared, slamming his fist upon the table. "If we do not cut it out, it will consume us all." His plan was simple: burn the stone house with Benjamin inside. Fire was the only thing, he argued, that could cleanse such corruption. But the doctor resisted with frantic desperation. He warned that killing the boy might unleash something worse, that destroying the vessel would scatter the language like ash upon the wind. "Contain him," he pleaded. "Study him. We may yet learn to resist." His voice cracked as he spoke, and the others saw it for what it was: obsession. The preacher spat at him, calling him already lost. That night, while snow drifted against the windows and the wind howled through the trees, the townsmen gathered torches and marched toward the stone house, their boots crunched in unison, their breaths heavy with dread. From a distance they could already hear the low murmur rising from inside. Benjamin's voice, joined now by others, chanting in unison. When the doors were thrown open, the sight froze them in place. The guards, once loyal, once afraid, were kneeling around the bow, in a circle, their eyes glassy, their lips moving in rhythm with his. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with spirals and hooked symbols as though dozens of hands had carved them. The air pulsed with heat, though no fire burned, and the sound of the chant seemed to vibrate the marrow of their bones. "End it now!" the preacher roared, thrusting his torch forward, but the torch flickered and died in his hand, as if swallowed by unseen breath. Another man tried, only for his flame to sputter and vanish the moment he stepped across the threshold. Panic surged through the mob. Some fled into the snow, dropping their torches. Others fell to their knees, clutching their heads as Benjamin's voice swelled, filling the chamber like a storm. Only the magistrate forced himself to move forward. He seized the boy by the shoulders, shaking him, shouting in English, "Stop this! Speak plain!" Benjamin only smiled, and then, in perfect English, he whispered his first words to them all. "You are already speaking it." The words struck the mob like a blow. For weeks, months, they had waited for the boy to speak a single word of their own tongue, and when he finally did, it was not comfort, not confession, but revelation. "You are already speaking it." The magistrate stumbled back, his face drained of blood. The preacher screamed for the men to hold firm, but his own voice faltered as he realized the truth. Half of what he had just shouted was not English at all. The guards, still kneeling in their circle, lifted their heads as one. Their lips moved, but no sound came. Instead, the air itself seemed to quiver, the syllables hanging not on breath, but vibrating in the walls, the floor, the marrow of the listeners. Men dropped their torches, clutching their ears, only to find that the sound was not entering through the ears at all. It was blooming inside their skulls. The doctor staggered forward, his eyes wild, shouting above the storm of voices. "It is too late. The language is a seed, and it has already taken root. You cannot burn it. You cannot kill it." He fell to his knees, scribbling frantically in his ledger, even as his hand betrayed him. The words that spilled from his pen were not English. They were the jagged, spiraled script of Ezra Harwick, reproduced with perfect precision, though the doctor had never been taught. Panic erupted. Some men fled into the night, running blindly into the snow, their screams echoing until they faded into the woods. Others clawed at their own mouths, as if trying to tear the foreign syllables from their tongues. The preacher seized the magistrate by the shoulders, shouting that the boy must be killed before the infection spread further. But the magistrate only stared at him, lips trembling, whispering words he did not understand, but could not stop himself from repeating. And Benjamin, the boy at the center of it all, rose slowly to his feet. For the first time, he looked less like a child and more like something ancient wearing the shell of one. His eyes swept across the room, and the chanting ceased. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Then, with deliberate clarity, he spoke a single word in his own language. The lanterns guttered out. The room plunged into darkness. And every man present realized the battle was no longer to contain the boy. It was to contain themselves. Darkness held the stone house like a tomb. The only sound was breathing, ragged, shallow, frantic. Men groped for matches, for lanterns, for anything to push back the black. But the dark itself seemed alive, thick as tar, pressing against their skin. And then, within that suffocating void, voices began to rise. Not Benjamin's alone this time, but many, scattered around the room, each man speaking in the alien tongue without meaning to. Words slipped from their mouths like blood from a wound, unstoppable, unchosen. One tried to scream for help, but the cry came out in spirals of sound that bent the air. Another attempted a prayer, only to find that the name of God caught in his throat, replaced by a word that clawed at the soul. The preacher fell to his knees, clutching his chest, forcing English through his teeth in broken fragments. "Our Father, who art..." But even his voice faltered, choked by syllables not his own. His prayer died as the new language consumed it. Then the lanterns flickered back to life, not lit by human hand, but by some unseen spark. The dim glow revealed Benjamin standing at the center of the chamber, his face serene, his eyes gleaming with calm that was more terrifying than rage. Around him, the guards still knelt, their foreheads pressed to the floor, as though worshipping something unseen. Their mouths moved in silent rhythm, lips shaping words without sound. The doctor, trembling, raised his ledger. "Do you not see?" he whispered hoarsely. "It is not corruption. It is revelation. Ezra was right. The boy is the vessel. The language is not invention, it is memory." He turned the book around, showing the pages now filled with spirals and jagged lines. "I cannot stop writing it. None of us can. It is inside us now." The magistrate staggered forward, his face grey, his lips trembling. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked, torn between English and the other tongue. At last he gasped a single question. "What are you?" Benjamin tilted his head, his small frame still, his eyes reflecting the flicker of flame. And then he answered, not in his own language, but in perfect English once again. "I am what was forgotten." The words fell heavy, a sentence that did not explain, did not comfort, but confirmed what they all feared. The boy was not merely learning, he was remembering, and he was making them remember too. The town of Ashford did not collapse with fire or plague, it collapsed in whispers. At first the sickness seemed confined to the chamber, to the handful of men who had witnessed the boy's words, but within days fragments of the language seeped into the streets. Children awoke in the night, crying out phrases their parents had never heard. Farmers in their fields found themselves humming melodies that bent into syllables they could not place. Wives scolded their husbands only to realize half their words were no longer English, and none could explain how they had learned it. The preacher fought hardest. He thundered from the pulpit, declaring it witchcraft, urging his flock to resist. "Guard your tongues, guard your minds," he roared, pounding the Bible until his knuckles split. But even as he preached, his sentences fractured, twisting into shapes that made the congregation shift uneasily in the pews. He wept at the altar that night, begging God to silence the voices. But in the stillness of the church, it was not God who answered, it was Benjamin. The boy appeared at the far end of the sanctuary, silent, barefoot, his face calm. The preacher demanded he leave, demanded he repent, but Benjamin only opened his mouth, and the bells above began to toll, though no hands touched the ropes. The sound rolled over the town like thunder, carrying with it words no ear had chosen, but every heart understood. By morning, shops were closed, doors were barred. Families whispered behind shuttered windows, but even in their secrecy, they could not stop speaking it. Letters written in shaking hands carried the same spirals and jagged lines. Children drew it in the dirt without knowing why. Cattle herders carved it into fence posts. It spread like mold in damp walls, growing where no one had sown. The doctor no longer fought it. He moved through the town with a haunted devotion, filling ledger after ledger, every page identical to Ezra Harwick's cursed journals. "It is not contagion," he muttered to himself. "It is remembrance. We are not infected. We are awakening." His hands bled from the writing, but still he did not stop. And the magistrate, who had once prided himself on order, could only watch as his people unraveled. He tried to call meetings to restore reason, but no one could speak English long enough to make sense of his orders. His town was slipping from his grasp, syllable by syllable. And at the heart of it all, Benjamin waited. Beyond the frozen hills, whispers of Ashford's transformation began to drift into neighboring towns. At first they were dismissed as frontier gossip, tales of a cursed boy, a preacher's hysteria, a community turning in on itself. But travelers noticed things they could not ignore. Merchants returning from Ashford carried strange slips of parchment covered in symbols they swore they hadn't written. Teamsters sang low work songs that dissolved into syllables no man recognized, their voices breaking into tones that rattled the air like a second voice hidden beneath their own. One blacksmith from Millbrook told of a merchant who arrived at his forge, trying to trade but unable to speak a single word of English. His hands trembled, his mouth moved, and yet everything he said came out in the same spirals of sound. When pressed, the merchant wept, clutching his skull as if it might split apart, muttering only, "I do not know how I learned it. I do not know how to stop." Panic spread faster than the snow melt. Millbrook's elders warned their people to avoid Ashford at all costs, forbidding trade, cutting the roads. But fear only sharpened curiosity. Young men rode out at night, daring each other to cross into the silent town, to glimpse the boy said to carry a forgotten tongue. Some never returned. Those who did came back changed, quiet, distracted, speaking half in riddles, drawing on the walls of barns until their families drove them out. The preacher from Ashford, now gaunt and hollow-eyed, appeared one Sunday in a neighbouring parish. He stumbled into the sanctuary, his clothes torn, his Bible clutched to his chest. He tried to warn them, tried to speak of the corruption, but even as he stood in the pulpit, his tongue betrayed him. Every warning twisted into the new tongue until the congregation rose in fear, some crossing themselves, others weeping openly. The preacher screamed, clawing at his throat, but the sound that left him was not his own. He fled into the night, his cries echoing down the valley in syllables no one dared repeat. The towns around Ashford began calling it the language plague. They spoke of it as one might speak of cholera or fire, something that could leap across borders, something that must be contained. But already it was too late. Letters arrived filled with impossible writing. Children in Millbrook began whispering in their sleep, and in Ashford, Benjamin's voice grew stronger. The boy no longer needed to speak for the world to hear him. When the first reports reached Boston, the church dismissed them as superstition. When they reached New Haven, the magistrates called them rumor. But when they reached Salem, the word plague carried a weight too heavy to ignore. The memory of witch trials still haunted the soil, and whispers of a language no man could resist. A child who could unravel prayers drew the attention of men who made their living from fear. Letters were written, sealed, and dispatched. Within a month, a company of soldiers and a delegation of ministers were ordered to Ashford. They arrived in winter's grip, their horses stamping nervously at the frozen ground as the town emerged through the trees. Ashford was silent. No children played, no merchants called from their stalls. The snow lay unbroken on the streets, except for the countless markings scrawled into it, spirals, jagged lines, the very symbols that had haunted Ezra Harwick's notebooks. They covered the fences, the doors, the very walls of the homes, carved deep as though by desperate hands. The soldiers moved cautiously, rifles ready, their boots crunching in the snow. The ministers clutched their Bibles, whispering psalms under their breath. One of them, a severe man named Reverend Clark, sneered at the sight. "This is madness," he declared. "A trick, nothing more. They frighten themselves with their own imagination." But even as he spoke, the air seemed to bend, carrying a faint hum that made his words tremble. They found the townsfolk gathered in the square. Not one turned to greet the newcomers. They stood in rows, eyes glazed, lips moving in silence. At their center stood Benjamin. No longer a pale, frightened child, he carried himself with an unsettling calm. He did not flinch at the soldiers' rifles, nor bow at the minister's prayers. He simply watched, as though he had been expecting them. The captain of the soldiers stepped forward. "By order of the magistrates of New Haven, this town is under investigation for heresy and contagion," he declared. "You will surrender the boy." For the first time, Benjamin smiled. The crowd of townsfolk spoke as one. A single word in the forbidden tongue thundered from their mouths, shaking the snow from rooftops, rattling the iron barrels of the soldiers' guns. Horses screamed and reared, soldiers staggered, ministers fell to their knees, clutching their heads as if pierced by invisible blades. And Benjamin did not move at all. He simply waited, as though the demand to surrender him had been the very signal he had been waiting for. The order was given, sharp and desperate. "Seize him!" Rifles leveled, boots struck the snow, and the soldiers surged toward the boy. For a heartbeat, Benjamin did nothing. Then he blinked once, slowly, and the world seemed to fracture. The first soldier reached for him and froze mid-stride, his hand inches from Benjamin's shoulder. His eyes widened, his mouth opened, but no breath came. Instead, his chest heaved as though something inside him was forcing its way out. A sound tore from his throat, not a scream, not a word, but a chord, low, resonant, vibrating through bone and earth. His fellow soldiers faltered, trying to pull him back, but the moment they touched him, the same sound erupted. Deed from their mouths, rifles fell to the ground, men clutched their helmets, convulsing as their bodies betrayed them, their throats shaping syllables none of them understood, yet all of them spoke. The ministers shouted prayers, desperate incantations in the name of God, but their Latin cracked, splintering into the forbidden tongue. Pater Noster became something else, syllables jagged and raw. One minister's eyes rolled back as he clawed at the Bible, the words on the page blurring and reshaping before his eyes into spirals and broken lines. He screamed, slamming the book shut, only to find the cover carved with the same symbols. The captain, face pale with terror, raised his pistol. His hands shook violently, yet he forced himself to aim. "Devil!" he spat, his voice cracking. "In the name of the crown, I will end you." He pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, deafening in the cold air, but the bullet never struck. It slowed in mid-flight, spinning lazily before dropping harmlessly into the snow at Benjamin's feet. The boy had not moved. Not a hand raised, not a flinch. His calm eyes simply met the captain's, and in that gaze the man felt his will dissolve. The pistol slipped from his grip, his knees buckled, and he fell into the snow, weeping without sound. Then Benjamin finally spoke. Just one word, soft and measured, yet it rippled through the square like thunder. Every soldier dropped to the ground. Every minister collapsed. The townsfolk stood firm, their voices rising as one, answering the boy's command with flawless unison. Ashford was no longer a town. It was a choir, and Benjamin was its conductor. Word of the failed seizure spread faster than winter wind. The few soldiers who staggered back from Ashford were broken men, their eyes hollow, their speech fragmented. Some never spoke again in English, their mouths moving only in the forbidden tongue until they were cast out, chained, or left to wander in the woods like madmen. Others returned to Boston and New Haven to deliver reports so fractured they read more like prophecy than testimony. They spoke of rifles useless, of prayers inverted, of a child who could halt bullets with a glance. Ministers recoiled in horror, declaring Ashford damned, a nest of heresy. The magistrates were more practical. If steel and scripture could not contain it, fire would. Orders were signed and men with torches were gathered. Ashford, they decreed, would be erased. But even as these plans were drawn, the language slipped beyond the town's borders. Letters written by trembling hands arrived at neighboring parishes, filled with jagged symbols no one admitted to writing. Farmhands sang while they worked, only to stop and realize they had never learned the songs spilling from their lips. Mothers overheard their infants babbling in the same strange cadence, syllables too deliberate to be chants. Fear twisted into obsession. Some tore down their barns, burned their fields, praying the flames would purify what words had corrupted. Others leaned into the mystery, whispering the forbidden syllables in the dark, tasting the power that lurked within them. For the first time, men and women felt the language not as curse, but as gift, a way of speaking that seemed to make the very earth listen. In Ashford itself, no resistance remained. The boy's voice carried through the town without effort, each utterance echoed by 100 mouths. Shops remained closed, but the townsfolk no longer seemed to need trade. They no longer seemed to need sleep. Night after night, the square filled with voices chanting in perfect unison, each word shaping the air, bending the flame of lanterns, making the snow fall in strange spiraled patterns. The doctor's journals, now numbering dozens, spoke of it with reverence. "This is not infection," he wrote. "It is realignment. We are being brought back to what was. Benjamin does not teach. He reminds. We are not learning a new tongue. We are remembering the first is to one, the one that was spoken before Babel split us apart." And beyond Ashford, others began to wonder if the doctor was right. The night chosen to burn Ashford was moonless, the air heavy with the promise of snow. 2 companies of soldiers marched under orders from the magistrates, accompanied by ministers carrying crosses, salt, and scripture. Their faces were grim, their silence broken only by the crunch of boots and the rattle of torches. The plan was simple. Surround the town, ignite every structure, and let the flames consume the corruption within. No one spoke of Benjamin by name. To name him was to admit he could not be killed like the rest. As they approached, the square appeared before them, filled with the townsfolk standing shoulder to shoulder. They made no move to flee, no cry of fear. Their eyes glowed faintly in the torchlight, unblinking, fixed on the soldiers with a calm that unsettled even the most hardened men. And in the center stood Benjamin, his small hands folded, his face lit by the flicker of fire. The captain raised his torch high. "On my mark," he barked, his voice hoarse with nerves. Soldiers moved forward, spilling oil onto wooden walls, straw roofs, shutters marked with spirals carved deep into the grain. The torches dipped, the flames kissed the wood, and the fire refused to take. The oil smoked, the straw blackened, but the flames bent unnaturally, recoiling as if pushed back by an invisible hand. Torches guttered and went out. The men cursed, struck flint, tried again. Still, the fire sputtered and died. One soldier, desperate, hurled his torch directly onto a thatched roof. The crowd did not flinch. The flame flared once, then curved downward, snuffed into ash before it could spread. Then the townsfolk opened their mouths. The sound that followed was not chant, not song, but a single sustained note that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The soldiers staggered, clutching their ears, but the sound was not heard through ears. It thrummed in their bones, in their teeth, in the blood pounding their temples. Horses screamed, buckling and fleeing into the dark. Ministers dropped their crosses, their scripture fluttering into the snow as words blurred into spirals before their eyes. The captain screamed for retreat, but his voice was swallowed, his orders bent into the note, reshaped, repeated by his own men against their will. And Benjamin, still silent, raised his hand. The flames, denied the buildings, now turned inward, catching the torches themselves, crawling up soldiers' arms, devouring flesh while leaving their uniforms untouched. The night meant to erase Ashford became its coronation. When dawn came, the road to Ashford was littered with the wreckage of retreat, dropped rifles, burned standards, horses wandering riderless with eyes rolled white in terror. Only a fraction of the soldiers staggered back to the garrison, their uniforms intact, but their flesh seared in ways no fire should leave. Their skin bore patterns, spirals, jagged lines, symbols carved not by blade or brand, but by the flames themselves. The magistrates demanded reports, but what they received were ravings. Soldiers spoke of fire that bent like a living thing, of torches turning against the men who carried them, of a boy who never lifted his voice yet commanded the very elements. One minister sat in silence, his hands folded, lips moving endlessly in the forbidden tongue. When questioned, he would only repeat the same 3 words over and over, until his voice grew raw. It remembers us. Word spread swiftly. To the fearful, Ashford was a contagion that defied steel, scripture, and fire. To the desperate, it became something else. Proof of power, proof of prophecy. Travelers from distant towns began to drift toward the valley, not fleeing from Ashford but seeking it out. Some came to beg Benjamin for healing of their afflictions, whispering that a boy who could bend flame could also mend flesh. Others came with greed, hoping to harness the language for their own ends. A few came simply to kneel in the snow and join the voices. Ashford welcomed them all. The town no longer functioned as a town. Trade ceased, crops were left untended, homes abandoned. The people gathered instead in the square day and night, their chants shaping the air until the very snow seemed to fall in patterns, spiraling downward as though obeying. Hunger did not gnaw at them, exhaustion did not weigh them. They lived on something else, something carried in every word Benjamin breathed. The doctor, now gaunt and wild-eyed, chronicled it with manic devotion. "It is no longer contagion," he wrote, filling his final ledger with blood where ink had run dry. "It is alignment. The language restores what the body needs. We are fed not by bread but by remembrance. Soon they will not call it plague. They will call it covenant." And so the boy, who once sat silent under torchlight, had become more than prisoner, more than prophet. Benjamin had become the axis around which an entire town turned. By spring, the name of Ashford was spoken in whispers across the colonies. Merchants avoided its roads, yet their ledgers bore strange marks they swore they had never written. Ministers thundered warnings from pulpits, yet found their sermons unraveling into the very language they condemned. Magistrates met in closed chambers, debating whether Ashford was a sickness to be stamped out or a miracle too dangerous to deny. But in the taverns and the back alleys a different conversation grew. Men who had lost children to fever, women broken by hunger, wanderers crushed by debt, all whispered of a place where the people no longer starved, where pain and fatigue dissolved into air, where a boy's single word could bend the world itself for very fearful warnings shouted by the authorities. There were two desperate souls who began the journey toward the valley. Soon, Ashford was no longer a town of a few hundred. Pilgrims came from every direction, stumbling through forests and over rivers, driven by hunger, by sickness, by longing. They entered the square trembling, yet the moment they heard the chants they fell silent. Some resisted for minutes, hours even, but none resisted long. The language slid into them like a second breath, and when Benjamin looked upon them, when he gave even the smallest nod, their voices joined the choir. The rulers of New Haven and Boston watched with dread. If a single boy could draw hundreds into his fold without promise of coin or comfort, what else could he draw? Armies, nations, revolts? Already the pilgrims who returned spoke with fire in their eyes, declaring that Ashford was not cursed, but chosen. "He speaks the first tongue," they whispered. "He speaks the word before all words." A council was called in secret. Some argued to send more soldiers, more fire, more force. Others urged caution, fearing that each attempt only fed the legend. One old minister, shaking with fever, rasped the question none wanted to speak aloud. What if the boy is not a heretic? What if he is a beginning? No answer came, but even as they argued, reports arrived of villages miles away, where children now babbled in the strange tongue before they could form their first English words. The plague was no longer in Ashford alone, it was in the womb of the colonies themselves. By midsummer, Ashford no longer resembled the frontier village it once was. Its fences rotted where they stood, its fields lay unploughed, its shops and homes abandoned to vines and dust. Yet the town was not empty. The square pulsed with life, voices rising and falling in unison, a rhythm older than speech itself. Pilgrims filled the streets not as travelers but as supplicants, sleeping in doorways, kneeling in the snow-melt mud, their eyes fixed on the boy who now ruled without decree. Benjamin had not grown taller nor stronger. He was still a child in frame, but in presence he was colossal. When he walked through the crowd, men and women parted as though he were a king. Mothers lifted their infants toward him, weeping when the children babbled syllables that matched his own. The sick touched his garment and gasped as fevers broke, wounds knit, hunger vanished. No gesture was grand, no miracle performed with spectacle, yet the results were undeniable. Ashford had become a sanctuary. The chants no longer filled only the square. They spread into the forests, echoing through the trees at night like wind through hollow bones. Travelers miles away reported hearing them, faint but steady, carried across rivers and hills. Some claimed the voices spoke directly into their dreams, pulling them from their beds to follow paths they had never walked before. And still the authorities hesitated. Every attempt to destroy Ashford had ended in failure, humiliation, or horror. Fire bent, bullets fell, prayers broke. The magistrates feared a war they could not win, not with soldiers, not with scripture. Yet neither could they allow the settlement to swell unchecked. For each pilgrim who joined, 10 more whispered of going. The colonies themselves trembled on the edge of something vast, something uncontrollable. The doctor, gaunt and hollow-eyed, stood at Benjamin's side as chronicler. His journals grew darker with each entry. "This is not growth," he wrote. "This is unveiling. The boy does not create a new order. He uncovers the old one buried beneath us all. Every voice that joins him is not converted but recalled. We are remembering what we were before we were divided. And once enough, remember, nothing will hold." Ashford had ceased to be a town. It had become a beacon, and the world beyond its borders was beginning to turn toward its light. Far beyond Ashford's valley, the boy's shadow stretched into places he had never seen. In Boston, Churchmen quarrelled with red-faced fury, some calling him the mouthpiece of the devil, others whispering he might be the herald of revelation. In New Haven, magistrates drafted edicts forbidding travel to Ashford, punishable by imprisonment, but enforcement was impossible. Too many guards deserted, their tongues betraying them with syllables they swore they never learned. Even across the ocean in London, word arrived in hushed dispatches, a colonial settlement where bullets did not strike, where fire bent, where a child commanded a people through language alone. Some dismissed it as colonial hysteria, others saw it as threat and opportunity. Agents were dispatched quietly, men who served not church or crown, but the hunger of empires. If the boy's tongue could sway masses, bend the elements, then it must be seized, studied, mastered. For what empire could fall if it spoke with a single voice, unbreakable, undeniable? But religion moved faster than empire. A council of ministers gathered in secret, candlelight flickering on their drawn faces. One slammed his Bible shut, declaring Benjamin an antichrist. Another wept openly, insisting the boy was the second Adam, restoring the tongue that God himself had once given mankind. Their debate turned violent. One struck another across the table, voices rising, until even there the forbidden syllables began to slip between English words. The men froze, horrified, realizing the contagion had reached them too, though none had set foot in Ashford. Meanwhile, Benjamin said nothing of these debates. He did not seek to expand, did not send envoys or threats. He merely stood in the square, a child among ruined houses, and spoke when he chose. Yet every word he uttered carried outward, echoing in hearts he had never seen. Power flowed to him without conquest, authority bent to him without demand. Still, both crown and church agreed on one thing. Ashford could not be left to grow unchecked. Armies might fail, fire might falter, but strategy remained. Whispers spread of infiltration, of agents sent not with guns or torches but with daggers hidden beneath cloaks, with poison mixed into bread, with sermons twisted into snares. If Benjamin could not be crushed by open force, perhaps he could be cut down by treachery. Yet those who plotted in shadows had not grasped the deeper truth. Benjamin did not need walls or guards. He already dwelled inside their tongues.